to class, and in this class this should be a short lesson, and this short lesson is module 3 of um, module 3 lesson 6 of the product owner training. Module 3 lesson 6 of the um, product owner training. And in this lesson we would quickly look at the product increment from the angle of the product owner. In the previous two lessons, we looked at the first Scrum artifact, making reference to the product backlog, and then the second Scrum artifact, making reference to the sprint backlog. So here is the third Scrum artifact, the product increment. And we said in module 2 that the product increment is the shippable value at the end of a sprint. Is what had been developed that adds up to what had previously been developed. So the increment begins to grow from sprint to sprint until the entire product is developed. That's why we call it a product increment. It's building up, it's growing. So a piece joins what had been developed previously and it begins to grow. That's what we call the product increment. Right, I mentioned it would be a short class. So let's have a quick look at it. The flow from the product backlog, it moves some work items, stories, move from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. And the team works on the sprint backlog in the course of the sprint. That is what they focus on to deliver. And at the end of the sprint, what they deliver is the third artifact, which is the product increment, which is the deliverable. So for a moment, just quickly again, from the product backlog, the first artifact, we have some work items, duties or tasks moved into the sprint to be worked on in the course of the sprint. That's what gives us the sprint backlog, the second artifact. And in the course of the sprint, it's worked on and delivered as the increment, the third artifact. So quickly, let's look at what these are, the product increments. What are those tangibles that could form the product increments? So a product increment could be the potentially shippable increments of the product. What is valuable? It could be an MVP software. MVP stands for minimum viable product. We've dedicated a class to that. So when we go further, we would understand what the MVP, minimum viable product, is. But just as a quick one, the minimum viable product is the bare minimal functional usable tangible products that could be developed. That's the minimum viable product. It's just the bare minimum functionality of that product that could first be developed. We use MVP to test the waters, right? So we could have MVP as a software, MVP as a hardware also. Then a research work could form your deliverable. So we're looking at what could a team work on in the course of the sprint and deliver. So when you go through a research work at the end of the sprint, you are expected to deliver a presentation on that research work or a value to that particular research work. Then of course that could also be a new process that would be your MVP, something of value or something that could be measured also. All this would make up the product increment, which means any of these based on what the team is focusing on. So, in a nutshell, we could say that your product increment should be the sprint goal achieved at the end of the sprint. When your team is able to achieve your sprint goal, that would translate into your product increment. Is that clear? When we have the sprint goal delivered, when we get here where the team is having a sprint goal, what they want to deliver, accomplish in a sprint. Let's say, for instance, in this sprint, we want to deliver the foundation, we want to deliver the approver, we want to do some form of the block wall. So at the end of the sprint, when we deliver these ones, those ones will be the product increments. So that means the sprint goal is being translated to your product increment. The sprint goal, when delivered, would become your product increment. And the last slide for this particular class is this. Before we could deliver any product, there's what we call the definition of done. Right? In Module 2, we spoke about definition of ready. Definition of ready is what determines if a story is ready to sprint or not. So let's now look at what definition of done is. Definition of done is quality in Scrum is achieved through the definition of done, where done means absolute completion of a functional increment. When you have fully completed a functional increment, that's when we say it is done. On the field, we often call it done, right? In your story, in subsequent classes, we would look closer at what we call acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria comes with each of the story, and acceptance criteria means how do we know that you have done what you committed to in the sprint. So this is how the acceptance criteria works. While the product owner is writing each of those stories, is also adding the expectation at the end of completing that story. So that forms the acceptance criteria. Before I accept this task as done, what should I look out for? So for instance, you are to build a wall for the building. Let's say a portion of the wall you need to build. You need to build the wall from the lintel level to the roof. So your acceptance criteria could be, or one of the elements in the criteria could be that you have walls up to 5 meters as part of what you expected. So when the product owner is checking that story, when the tester also is checking that story, is checking what you have claimed you have done against what the acceptance criteria is. So the acceptance criteria forms that piece of that story that measures when that work had been done. But it is not written after the work had been done. It's written when you are giving the work out to that particular developer. Right? I make this illustration. Let's say, for instance, you want to sew a cloth. You are to attend a party and you want to sew a cloth, and you went to your tailor and you gave your tailor the material for the cloth, and your tailor took the measurement. Your tailor has different developers, right? Tailors, um, apprentice tailor, experienced tailors in his workshop. So he calls one of them, take the measurements of this client, right? So you drop the material, you check the design that is needed, you pick a particular design, and your measurement is taken, and you are asked to come back for it, or it will be delivered to you. Let's assume it will be delivered to you on a um, on a particular agreed date. You agreed to a date when the material would be ready. Now you leave, and the tailor or the sewing um, business place gets to work. In the course of it, the owner of the store, that is the let's assume that is the product owner of that store, whom you gave the work to, now detailed out all the specification needed to sew that cloth, and attached all the diagrams or the design or pattern to it, where you need to put the button, where you need to put the embroidery and all the rest, and writes out what he expects. So when the tailors finish developing, sewing those cloth or that particular cloth, the product owner, that's the owner of that business, who also has good knowledge of sewing, who also understands clearly what you, the client, want, would check what you have done against the instructions he had given you. That forms the acceptance criteria. So the tailor sewing that cloth would consider the measurement of the cloth, and they will be sewing as to the measurements of the cloth. They would also be sewing to the design of the cloth as well. They will be sewing according to all the specifications you have given in that particular cloth. So that is what we mean by acceptance criteria. So when you are checking, when the tailor says, Oga, I have finished sewing this cloth, and it comes back to you, you are checking against the instructions, the acceptance criteria you gave earlier. So that's what we mean by acceptance criteria. But why acceptance criteria becomes a piece in what we call done, definition of done, is because in that illustration, yes, the tailor had finished sewing that cloth and he followed all the specification you gave, but at the point the tailor finished sewing that cloth, it's not the same way you would deliver that cloth to the client. The duty of sewing had been completed, but there are still other things to be done, including ironing that cloth, folding that cloth appropriately, ironing it properly because it needs to be shipped, bagging it, packaging the cloth, putting possibly the label of the um, industry or the workshop that had sewed that cloth on it, including taking it out for delivery and sending it and shipping it. All those would form the definition of done. So that's why we see here that definition of done is more than just the acceptance criteria. It contains checking that there are no errors, the technical depth, right? No technical depth, there are no errors, there are no faults. Yes, the cloth had been sewed according to specification, but you are now checking, are there no loose threads? Are there no, oil stain? Had it been done properly beyond just sewing the cloth? Then all testing has been completed. You are checking properly to make sure that it meets exactly what it is meant for. There are no loose ends. You are checking the button holes to be sure that the button holes, after being created, had been opened so that the buttons could go inside. You are checking the alignment of the lower end, all those things. So all these would make up definition of done. Code had been reviewed. This has to do with software development. Then the increment was accepted by the product owner. What we mean by increment was accepted by the product owner. Delivery, development stops by the developer, stops here. Then the tester checks it and is sure or certain that it had been done, moves it here. But beyond the tester checking also, the product owner, we mentioned that in module 2, that only the product owner has the responsibility to accept a completed work. So the product owner is also accepting the work as completed. So that is what we mean by this. So done could be modified as the team matures and more information comes in. What this means is that the definition of done for the team is also predefined. While the team is going into production, they are clearly defining their definition of done. Before we say any work is done, in practice, one of the elements you would also find in definition of done is documentation. And in basics, agile, that is how agile keeps documentation of the product that had been developed. So depending on different teams or different organizations, they would come up with their own definition of done. So what had been predefined as the team's definition of done is then now what could be modified. Mind you, it's agile. Anything agile is subject to adjustments, should be flexible, should not be rigid. So as time goes on, where there is need for us to adjust definition of done, we would also be doing that. Then lastly, quality can also be achieved through pair programming. We're not discussing much about this. This is out of this scope directly, but what it means on a lighter note is where two developers are paired together, and while one is leading, the other is navigating. One is driving, writing the code, the other is checking the code. So it ensures that quality is delivered from the onset. That is what that means. Um, Hopefully there should be a different class that would take us through that. Pair programming could be found from agile engineering practices. All right, so that will be all for this class. If you have any question or where you want us to expand upon, please let me know and I'll be glad to do that. We'll see you again.